I wanted this to be good. I really did. But that being said, I still think you'll enjoy this episode of Things You Missed. Stick around to the end of this video if you want to hear about all the connections to other Stephen King novels. The new 2019 adaptation of Pet Sematary takes a lot of inspiration from the 1989 version of the film, which is kind of surprising to me. When we covered the original, you can watch that Things You Missed episode right here, I talked about the foreshadowing where Gage is seen crashing the red toy truck. The 2019 Gage offers a similar clue in the car when the family drives to the house. He smashes a toy truck into the carrying case that they use to transport their cat, Church. As they arrive in Ludlow, Lewis drives through the downtown area, and I'm obviously using that term lightly, but this isn't something that's in the first movie, and it's not really in the book. But it does kind of resemble the downtown Ludlow seen in Pet Sematary II. It may be that both films are basing this off of a real-life location, but I wasn't able to find one in a quick Google search. Lewis is seen in a Cape Cod shirt, and the reason for that is that the Creed family is now from Boston as opposed to Chicago. This may seem like a popular choice now, but we'll see who wins the World Series and Super Bowl this year. When they first arrive at their new property, Lewis makes an offhand comment about the Gweat and Tewwible. This line also comes up again when Ellie mentions it during her killing spree at the end of the movie. But what is the Gweat and Tewwible? This is a line from the book that becomes a motif and is repeated throughout. The term originates when Rachel is helping nurse her dying sister Zelda as a child, where she pronounces the classic Wizard of Oz character as Oz the Gweat and Tewwible. It serves as a label for Zelda's horrible behavior towards the family in her final days, and it constantly pops into Lewis's head as a representation of his demons during this story. The last section of the book is titled Oz the Gweat and Tewwible. Before Lewis starts his job at the University of Maine Infirmary, he mentions that his previous occupation was working the graveyard shift at the emergency room, a little nod to Stephen King's short story, Graveyard Shift, which also became a movie.
This is the new horror from the mind of Stephen King. Graveyard Shift.
He also mentions that he had to treat 4 bloody noses on his first day. This phenomenon is further explained in the book. Basically, the university students would come in with minor issues in order to get out of their exams. Back at the house, Rachel and Ellie explore their new property when they come across the funeral procession of kids wearing animal masks. The drumbeat played by these children as they make their way to the pet cemetery is very tribal, and the ritualistic practices are very reminiscent of a Native American practice, like perhaps the burial practices of the Micmac Indians who buried their dead in the area beyond the pet cemetery. Ellie would later go back and check out the pet cemetery for herself, and when she does, there's a little picture frame in the bottom right corner with a photo of a parrot, a reference to a grave that Lewis notices in the book for a pet named Polynesia, who died in 1953. The headstone for Trixie appears almost exactly as it is described in the book, right down to the misspelled "Kilt on the Highway," and only foregoing the date of death. There's another pet grave marker that King described in the book who appears in the movie, and that is Biffer. In the book, Biffer is a Cocker Spaniel belonging to the Deslers family, and Biffer was run down by a dumpster truck 1 year before Lewis brings his family to Maine. But in this movie, Biffer is Judd Crandall's childhood dog who he revived in the Micmac grounds before finally laying him into rest in the pet cemetery. Judd's dog in the book is named Spot, so I'm not really sure why these things were switched, much like a lot of things in this movie. One more detail on this scene. Ellie's shirt has a butterfly design on it. There are a few examples of butterfly imagery associated with Ellie. There's a picture of a butterfly framed above the family during dinner, and she also draws a picture of a butterfly and a bee later on. This drawing connects to the scene where Ellie wears the butterfly shirt, where she gets stung by a bee while trying to climb the deadfall that leads to the Micmac burial grounds. But why was she drawn towards the burial grounds? The answer comes later on when Judd is explaining why he showed Lewis the burial ground, despite his own dog coming back evil. He tells Lewis that you just find the sweetest smelling reasons to go back to the burial ground. So if Ellie represents a butterfly, I think she's attracted to the sweet smelling flower that is the Micmac grounds. When Ellie returns from the pet cemetery, she has some questions for her father about death, which brings up an argument between Lewis and Rachel about how it should be explained to their children. This triggers a flashback to Rachel's childhood, where she had to tend to her sister Zelda. In the 1989 movie, Zelda's wardrobe matches that of this creepy painting seen in the house. In this 2019 film, she wears the same gown as the Grady twins from The Shining. A patient named Victor Pascoe is brought into Lewis at the university after being struck by a car. Lewis has no chance to save him, and after his death, the lights flicker as he comes back to give Lewis a warning. The flickering lights seem to be a side effect of the appearance of ghosts, because when Pascoe comes back later to give Lewis a second warning, the lights flicker in Lewis's basement. Ellie goes over to bring some cookies to Judd Crandall, who they still don't really know at that point, so I'm kinda surprised that Rachel would let her go inside of this guy's house alone. But luckily for Ellie, this is the Pet Sematary movie, not Romeo Lacoste's YouTube channel. all, but there are some noteworthy details in Judd's house. He's a hunter in this movie, and he's even got the typical deer mount on his wall. You have to wonder if he became a hunter to try to get revenge on the Wendigo, the deity that revives corpses in the Micmac grounds and possessed his dog Biffer. The Wendigo legends tell of a creature with a stag's head, so maybe Judd was searching for the Wendigo when he acquired this mount. There are a couple of other references to the Wendigo. We hear its call at the very beginning of the movie. And as Judd exits the forest for the first time, you hear the bugs go crazy. I think this has something to do with the Wendigo's influence. After burying Church, Judd explains the curse of the Wendigo to Lewis and how he first found out about it from a boy named Stanny B. And finally, Lewis researches the mythos in this book on northeastern tribes. I did a whole video on the 400-year history of the Wendigo in Pet Sematary, which you can watch right here, or just look for a link in the description at the end of this video. Judd also tells Ellie about his wife Norma, who got sick and passed away years ago. Norma is actually a character who doesn't pass away until 3 months into the novel. Lewis saves her life when she had a heart attack on Halloween, which is part of the reason that Judd feels he has to help Lewis revive his daughter's cat as kind of a thank you of sorts. But in both movie adaptations now, Norma's already dead before the story begins. At least she is mentioned in the 2019 film, and when Judd faces zombie Ellie in the final act, she seems to take the form of Norma momentarily to mess with Judd. Ellie's favorite pastime is dancing. She can be seen doing the dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy from the ballet The Nutcracker. The Nutcracker is a ballet about a toy nutcracker that comes to life and battles with the Queen of Mice. In the story, the family's cat is brought back to life and acquires a habit of killing small animals like mice and birds, although the only example I think we see in this film is Church bringing home a dead bird. Victor Pascow tries to give another warning to Lewis by taking him to the Pet Sematary and showing him the border that should not be broken. At the end of this sequence, a hand comes out of the ground and grabs him. This could be a reference to the iconic scene from Carrie, or at the very least, a clue that Lewis is going to the land beyond the Pet Sematary, and that could put him in danger of being attacked by zombies. The next major event comes on Halloween. Ellie is dressed as a witch, and she jokingly threatens to put a spell on Judd, to which he replies, "You already have." This could be a subtle reference to the fact that the Wendigo already casted an influence on Judd all those years ago when he buried his dog. In fact, later that night when they go to bury Church, Judd takes Lewis to the Pet Sematary, and unlike the book and the original movie, it looks like Judd's original intention is to let Lewis bury Church in the Pet Sematary. But if you watch the scene, there's a noticeable moment where something gets Judd's attention and he stares off at the deadfall in the direction of the cursed burial ground. It's like I mentioned earlier, the Wendigo traps him with the sweet smell of the burial ground, and there's nothing he can do to resist it. Ellie goes trick-or-treating with 2 other kids dressed as ghosts, which may represent Pascow and Church, the 2 deaths that have occurred up to that point.
That's the cutest thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
When Judd tells Lewis about his cat being killed, he mentions it was one of those Orinco trucks. Orinco is a trucking company that's most prominently seen in the Pet Sematary novel, where they run down Church and Gage, and they also make smaller appearances in some other Stephen King works. When they're going to bury Church, Lewis notices this spiral image on the trees. When they're later researching the burial ground, they see more imagery of this spiral. What does this mean? In King's novel, the spiral serves as a symbol of the bridge between the world of the living and the gulf. When Lewis visits Gage's grave one night, he finds himself thinking about the layout of the Pet Sematary and how it mimics the ancient religious symbols seen on the tombs of pharaohs, the barrows of Venetian kings, cave walls, Stonehenge, and Bibles. Then he shocks himself by looking down and realizing that he has drawn the spiral with his finger in the dirt subconsciously. When he goes back to the burial grounds to rebury Gage, he notices that the rock cairns knocked over by the revived corpses who are escaping their tombs come together to form a gigantic spiral when seen from above. So Lewis and Judd successfully bury Church, and the next night, Church returns from the dead and goes back to Ellie's room. Rachel tells Lewis, "Good thing you're not a vet," which is another little nod to the 1991 film Pet Sematary II, which is not based off of any of Stephen King's writing, but features a main character who's a vet. Lewis goes to confront Judd, who explains everything about the Wendigo. They look at a map where you can spot that they're in close proximity to Little God's Swamp, the area in between the Pet Sematary and the Micmac burial ground in the book, where Lewis has his encounter with the Wendigo. The Wendigo isn't shown in either movie, but there is a moment where he hears a branch snap and looks into the distance, where, based on his reaction, it is implied that something moved. He also looks up old headlines from the Ludlow Tribune that report on the incident with Hanratty the Bull. This is another small Easter egg pointing to events in the novel, where a man named Zach McGovern tried to revive his prized bull using the Micmac burial ground, and the bull came back as one of the most evil creatures ever to be revived. It would charge at small animals, people, and even trees swaying in the breeze. It caused a ton of damage around town, nearly destroying itself before being put back down. There's also a brief glimpse at a headline about Timmy Baterman, the son of Bill Baterman. Timmy died in World War II, and his grief-stricken father tried to bring him back by burying him in the Indian burial ground. If you've seen the original movie, you know a little bit more about this story, but it's only mentioned in passing in this new one. So with Church being back, Ellie tries to comb his fur, but she has a hard time, exclaiming, "Church, you're so sticky. There's something gross." Well, you shouldn't have let Shane Dawson babysit your cat, should you? But in all seriousness, this serves as a setup for when Lewis tries to comb Ellie's hair in the bath after her death, and discovers the staples still in the back of her head that were used to hold her together for the funeral. But before we get to that, I want to highlight the scene where Lewis notices Ellie drawing pictures. I already mentioned the significance of the butterfly and bee drawing, but there are two other drawings that may be significant. Ellie's other drawing is a picture of what appears to be a whale in front of a rainbow. Now this one, I admit, this could be a stretch, but I'm just gonna say it and let you decide how intentional it actually was. So the zombie version of Ellie would later use the form of Zelda as a psychological attack on Rachel. And the Legend of Zelda video game franchise has 3 flying leviathan creatures that resemble whales, known as Levias, the Windfish, and Oceus. Again, I'm not saying this was an intentional connection, but it seems like a strange thing for a child to draw. The other picture is drawn by Gage, and it appears as a disturbing image of a monster, which is implied to be a warning about the Wendigo. I did a video where I talked about how Ellie uses the shine to try to warn her father about the dangers that await them, but since Ellie and Gage's roles are switched for some reason in this movie, I think this confirms that Gage is now the resident psychic. He's also the one who later has the dream about Pascal that later sends Rachel rushing back to Maine to try to stop Lewis from reburying their daughter. So if you thought Rachel taking a cross-country flight based on the dream of a child was a bit much, in this movie she's going back based on the dream of a 2-year-old. Maybe that's why they switch Rachel's family to being from Chicago to Boston in this one. It's a bit of a shorter trip and perhaps more believable. But before we get to that part, there's a scare with Church possibly attacking Gage in his crib, which leads Lewis to release the cat just before Ellie's 9th birthday party. They invite some of their friends from Boston to this party, and one of them can be overheard in the background muttering something about a big Saint Bernard with rabies. This is a reference to another Stephen King book, Cujo, about a Saint Bernard dog who gets bit by a bat and turns into a dangerous beast. This reference also exists in different forms in both the novel and the 80s movie. But there's also a direct reference to the 80s movie itself, in that the truck driver is listening to a song called "Sheena is a Punk Rocker" by the Ramones when he runs over Gage. Sheena is a punk rocker, Sheena is a punk rocker. In the new movie, he gets distracted by a phone call from a contact named Sheena right before he hits Ellie. Ellie goes into the coffin wearing white, as a symbol for her purity and childlike innocence. When she later returns as a zombie, she changes into the dirty clothes that she wore during the accident, signifying that she's now tainted by the evil influence of the Wendigo. When Lewis returns from relocating his daughter's burial place to the Micmac grounds, I spotted a height measurement chart for kids in the Creed's house. This might be shown to make us think of the heights that Ellie will never reach, having met an early death, or it could just be about the fact that Lewis had to dig her up. The maximum height on the chart goes up to 6 feet. Actually, 6 feet isn't down there, it's more like right here. But 6 feet is typically the depth at which coffins are buried. When Lewis wakes up the next day, he hears Ellie once again dancing to the Sugar Plum Fairy song from the Nutcracker. But this time, her gracefulness is gone, and she's just wrecking the house and basically being a brat. Meanwhile, the rest of the family is staying with Rachel's dad in Boston. As I mentioned earlier, Gage has the shine and he senses something is wrong. A lot of characters throughout Stephen King's entire body of work have shining moments, but this one is particularly emphasized by the fact that Gage wakes up from his nap and starts screaming "Pascal" over and over in the same manner that Danny yells out "Red Rum" in The Shining.
Danny? Red rum! Red rum! Red rum!
Danny, what's the matter, hon?
Red rum!
You having a bad dream?
So this dream causes Rachel to drive back to Maine with Gage, where she gets stuck in traffic on the highway. On the side of the road, there's a sign saying that they're 20 miles from the exit for Derry, which is a fictional town in Stephen King's books, most notably the setting of It, Insomnia, and Dreamcatcher. The rest of the movie plays out very similarly to the original. Ellie brings a scalpel to a gunfight and then somehow wins, and then returns to her own house trying to kill Rachel. At this point in the movie, you can spot a painting of the Emerald City from The Wizard of Oz, another low-key reference to Oz the Gweat and Tewwible. It makes sense sense to see the painting at this point in the movie because Oz represents the evil entities that all the characters are starting to become. When Rachel makes it home and sees that Lewis has used this cursed magic to bring back their daughter, she disagrees with the decision because she realizes that it's not natural. Lewis has his own reason for doing it though. He argues, let God take his own kid. This is a reference to something Ellie says near the beginning of the book, after first discovering the Pet Sematary and learning about death.
He's not God's cat, he's my cat. But God gets on if he wants one, not mine.
The movie ends with Lewis getting impaled by a cross and Gage being the only one left, with his 3 zombie family members, 4 if we count Church, coming for him. I think it's implied that he doesn't survive, which to me, alright, let me just put my opinion just this once. It's less scary than letting the remaining child actually survive, because when Ellie survives in the original, she's gonna be stuck with all of those scarring memories, and also living with her douchebag grandparents, which is definitely not a plus.
You killer of children!
So the credits roll, but there's one more thing that you might have missed. Actually, I nearly did miss this myself because they turned off the audio to begin a Q&A with the cast and directors at my screening, but somehow I noticed this in the credits. A cover of Pet Sematary by the Ramones from a band called Starcrawler, which is cool because it's the same end credit music that Mary Lambert had in her adaptation of Pet Sematary, but also kind of defeats the purpose because the whole reason that she got the Ramones was as a reference to Blitzkrieg Bop, the most well-known and probably most expensive to license Ramones song, which was stuck in Lewis's head throughout the entire novel. That's one of the many things I talked about in my Things You Missed episode on the original Pet Sematary film, so click on the video on the left if you want to see that. Remember to subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring that death bell for notifications, and I'll see you in the next one. Assuming we both get buried in a pet cemetery.